When using the table saw, remove or fasten loose articles of clothing such as long sleeves, coats, neckties, etc. Gloves should never be worn when operating a table saw at any point, and one should always remove finger rings, bracelets, and other jewelry which have the potential for getting caught on the table saw or material. Wear industrial quality eye protection and ear protection when using the table saw, and keep the saw table and floors free of tools, wood stock scraps, sawdust, or oil and grease. Check the saw blade periodically for missing teeth and cracks. When the saw blades are changed, make certain that the blade arbor nut is tightened securely to hold the blade in place. Stand to one side of the saw blade when cutting. Do not allow others to stand directly in line with the saw blade when the saw is operating. Make certain that the saw guard, splitter, if available with the guard, anti-kickback fingers, and push sticks are used for all possible cutting operations. Never reach over the saw blade to remove or hold down a piece of stock. Wait until the blade comes to a complete stop before leaving the saw or working area. Students should devote their undivided attention to the work being performed on the table saw. Do not talk to others or engage in horseplay when using the table saw. Avoid awkward work positions which may result in slipping or contact with the saw blade at any given point. Support long and wide stock when sawing. Always use the saw guard, splitter, if equipped, and anti-kickback fingers when ripping a board. If a splitter is available, make sure it is aligned with the blade before being used. Before making any cuts, align the lock and rip fence in position, and always use a helper or off-bearer when cutting long stock on the machine. Always push the workpiece completely past the blade at the end of the cut to reduce the possibility of kickback. Disconnect the table saw electrical service at the circuit breaker or fuse box before changing blades or making any service adjustments to the machine. Round stock should never be cut or ripped on a table saw. When making bevel cuts, always keep hands in stock to the right side of the saw blade. Never remove small scrap from the saw until the blade has come to a complete stop, and use a push stick to remove all the scrap from the saw blade area. When possible, position the rip fence to the right of the saw blade. If the workpiece does not have a straight edge, fasten an auxiliary board to the top of the workpiece to provide the straight edge for the first cut. Set the rip fence for desired width of cut using the scale on the front rail, or, for more accurate cuts, measure the distance between the blade and the teeth of the fence with a tape measure. When cutting, use the left hand to hold the board against the fence and the table, and use the right hand to push the material through the saw. When the stock is less than 6 inches in width, use a push stick or push the trailing end through the saw. Never allow hands to come closer than 12 inches to the saw blade. Position the right hand so it is not in direct line with the saw blade, and remove the hand holding the stock down, or the left hand, as it approaches the saw guard. For narrow ripping cuts, where a push stick cannot be used, use a push block or an auxiliary fence. When ripping long boards, use a helper at the front of the table or at the off-bearer to support the cut stock as it comes through the saw. The off-bearer never pulls the stock. He or she only supports and moves with the stock as it comes through the saw. For materials shorter than 12 inches or narrower than 6 inches, always use a push stick or push block to push material between the fence and the saw blade. Never attempt to set the rip fence when the carriage extends beyond the end of the front rail on the table. Make sure the correct blade is used for ripping cuts. And if the lumber is warped, turn the curved side down when making any cut.
When ripping on the table saw, we use push sticks with different size of lips depending on the thickness of the boards that we're trying to cut. We start the cut, the thumb on the top of the board and the 4 fingers on the side. The fingers are pushing the board tight to the fence and the thumb is pressing down so the board doesn't pop. We advance the board forward and now we're cutting until your fingers on your right hand hit the back edge of the metal. That's when the push stick goes on. We step to the side, the left hand leaves, and we advance the board forward with the push stick at an angle toward the fence. Before you start the cut, you need to select the correct push stick. Once you have it in your hand, it should look directly like this. The push stick should always be angled toward the right with all 4 fingers underneath and your thumb on the top. So that way you can take all 5 fingers on the back edge of the board. Your left hand, when ripping a board, always has your 4 fingers on the side and your thumb on the top. Your thumb is pressing down and your fingers are pressing toward the fence. The fingers stay in the same spot as the board progresses forward. As your right hand fingers touch the metal on the edge of the table, your push stick then goes on at an angle. You step to the side, left hand leaves, and you advance the board forward until the board is past the blade. When you're ripping a board, if the board is wider to the point where you can see this line during a rip cut or before you start the cut, you don't need to use a push stick. If you can't see the line or the line is on the opposite side of the fence, you need to use a push stick at all times. To set the height of the blade to the correct height when you're making a cut on the table saw, the blade should always be 1/4 of an inch higher than the stock that you're cutting. And so to do that, as a guide, we move the blade downward and we wait till the top edge of the board is level with the U, or the U between the 2 teeth of the blade, and set it that direction. So there is no measurement necessary. And then lock the elevating hand wheel in place. When ripping boards with a dramatic warp to them, as you can see here, we always make sure that the warp is facing downward, so we have 2 points of contact touching the table at all times. And we set the blade height to 1/4 of an inch higher than the highest point of the wood to ensure that we cut all the way through the board the entire length.
Cross-cutting. Make sure the saw guard and splitter are in place when cross-cutting. Always use a miter gauge when cross-cutting, and be sure the miter head is set at the proper angle for the desired cut and securely clamped. Most workers prefer to use the right side table slot for the miter gauge when cross-cutting. Hold the stock against the miter head with the right hand and use the left hand to advance the miter gauge and material through the cut. Use the right hand table slot as well for making bevel or chamfer cuts. The right table slot is used for this operation so that the blade will tilt away from the operator's hands and the miter gauge. Always hold the material firmly against the miter head to prevent vibration and binding when the cut is being made. To improve the effectiveness of the miter gauge, some workers mount an auxiliary extension to the miter head. This extension should not extend beyond the right side edge of the table. Provide support for any material which extends beyond the edges of the saw table. And the miter head should be used when making cuts from 90 degrees to 45 degrees. The miter head should be adjusted relative to the slot of the table saw, and if needed, change the position of the pointer and stop on the miter head gauge to accurately read the degree for the miter cuts. The saw guard, splitter, if available, and anti-kickback fingers should be in place when making bevel or miter cuts. When beveling or making compound miter cuts, always use the fence or the miter head on the opposite side from which the blade is tilted. In our class, that would be to the right. This will maximize the distance the hands will be from the blade and help avoid binding between the saw blade and the tabletop. Bevel cutting is performed the same as described for ripping. Miter cutting is performed the same as described for cross cutting. And the miter head hold down clamps may be used to hold stock in place for accurate miter cuts.
When cross cutting, we always need to make sure that we keep the flat edge against the auxiliary fence or the gauge, the miter gauge. We don't ever want to put the rough edge against there, otherwise the board won't sit flat and will not cut straight. Whenever you're cross cutting, make sure you always cut on the waist side portion of the line to keep the board the exact length that you want. Ideally, you'd mark the waist side with an X so you know that the blade should be on this side of the line. The blade's 1/8 of an inch thick, thus we need to make sure we reference the waist side portion. This is the miter gauge. When you're cross cutting, it's meant to hold the board tight to it. When you have longer stock, most woodworkers or most designers choose to use an auxiliary fence, something like this. It gives them an extension of the miter gauge and allows for more of a clamping surface to the material that you're going to be cross-cutting. When cross-cutting, your left hand always goes on the left side of the miter gauge. Your right hand, with the right middle finger, goes on the black groove. Your other fingers go completely next to it. You tuck your thumb in. Then we advance the board forward on a continuous motion. Not too quick, but not too slow so we don't burn the wood. We bring it all the way past until the gauge stops. Then simply let it go. Reach down, turn off both switches so that your body is not in line with the waist side piece, and wait till the blade comes to a complete stop.